this is a huge deal because the battle lines have not fundamentally changed for quite a while, for years. Russia has been launching airstrikes. It's the first time Russia's done that in, I think, about 8 years. And the speed with which the Syrian armed forces have fallen away and fallen back is nothing short of extraordinary. So effectively, it's a sudden shaking up of Syria's conflict.
Let's start our show with developments in Syria, because the Syrian civil war appears to have been reignited after rebels opposing President Assad staged a shock assault on the country's second largest city of Aleppo. The Syrian army retreated this morning, giving up control of the city to the rebels. In response, Russian and Syrian warplanes have been bombing targets in the suburbs of Aleppo, the first airstrikes on the city in 8 years. Now, since Wednesday, the rebel forces have made gains in northwestern Syria, reclaiming more than 50 towns and villages before moving into western Aleppo on Friday night. Now, just before we came on air, I spoke with Shashank Joshi, who is defence editor at The Economist, to explain the significance of this escalation.
Well, it's very simple in some ways. Rebels in Syria have seized pretty much most of the country's second biggest city, Aleppo, and this is a huge deal because the battle lines have not fundamentally changed for quite a while, for years. Russia has been launching airstrikes. It's the first time Russia's done that in, I think, about 8 years. And the speed with which the Syrian armed forces have fallen away and fallen back is nothing short of extraordinary. So effectively, it's a sudden shaking up of Syria's conflict.
And does this mean that Assad is going to lose control, or is it too early to think about that?
No, I think it's much too early to say that. Of course, what this represents is a hollowing out of the Syrian armed forces and the Syrian state that's been occurring over a number of years. There's no doubt about that. A loss of legitimacy, a loss of cohesion, a loss of strength. It's also to do with the distraction and weakening of Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group, which has been battered by Israel and which had been earlier intervening in Syria on behalf of the Assad regime. But that's not necessarily to say that Assad's national grip on power is finished. He himself is thought to be in Moscow talking to Putin, discussing the situation. But I think we'd have to see developments in other parts of Syria more definitively to say that his days were numbered just yet.
And in terms of the Russian involvement, given that Russia is also fighting this big conflict with Ukraine, have the other side kind of taken advantage of that? Was Russia busy looking at Ukraine rather than Syria?
It was, although it should be said that Russia's principal contribution to the Syrian war was not ground forces. It wasn't the stuff that it's principally using in Ukraine. It was air power. It was air power, and you could actually say that years ago the Russian and joint Russian-Syrian bombing of cities like Aleppo really prefigured the bombing of Ukrainian cities that we would see after 2022. So there is still Russian air power in Syria. They've continued that. There's also Russian mercenaries in Syria, the group that was once called the Wagner Group, more recently, the Africa Corps, essentially Russian state-backed mercenaries. So they are still active. I think the key meaning of this is that the Russians haven't got necessarily much spare capacity to send to the regime in the way that they would have done perhaps 2 or 3 years ago.
And tell us about these rebels. Are they Islamists? Are they connected to Al-Qaeda? Who are they?
Well, HTS, they're undoubtedly Islamist by any reasonable definition. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. I think the interesting thing is that they publicly split with Al-Qaeda in 2017. And what's happened since then is that they're still an Islamist group, of course, but what they've done is crack down on Al-Qaeda and IS, Islamic State cells, in their stronghold, which is Idlib province. And they've tried to basically mainstream themselves. So they've got allies in Turkey. Turkey has played a pretty important role in this week's events from everything that we can see. They've tried to sort of effectively reach out to the international community, try and look more pragmatic, look more normal. They have basically said they're not interested in transnational jihad, so not interested in kind of conducting violence outside of Syria. There are still some people who are skeptical of this, who think ultimately they haven't changed their roots. They would still sort of, that's in their DNA, but they've been fundamentally changed, I think, in the last several years in a somewhat less radical direction, which is not to say they're a cuddly, friendly group that would, feel normal in average European politics.
And so it looks like they have taken control of the majority of Aleppo. What do you think comes next in Syria?
Actually, I think it's now the key is how far can they go? We're seeing the Syrian armed forces fall back from positions south of Aleppo. They're clearly consolidating. They're reeling. They're completely disoriented. And I think we'll have to see whether there's a kind of domino or cascade effect, and particularly whether places in other parts of Syria, whether we also see the regime's authority challenged. I think the really interesting thing for me, reflecting on the geopolitics of all this, Aisha, is that 10 years ago, Russia and America were important forces in Syria. America still has special forces inside Syria backing Kurdish-dominated militia groups in the north. And of course, similarly, the Russians are still there. But the Turks have become much more influential, and many of the Gulf Arab countries, like the United Arab Emirates, that once backed anti-Assad rebels, they are now reaching out to the Assad regime. So the whole politics of the conflict has been shaken up and reshuffled since the time when your listeners may last remember reading much about it or listening much about it.
Well, I think what many of my listeners, and I remember this myself very vividly, was of course the vote on whether Britain should get involved in airstrikes, which ended up being sort of defeated. That was a very contentious moment. People still remember that. What do you think this will mean for Britain, or what do you think Britain's response will be to this?
I think they'll be dealing with it one step at a time because I'm not sure they'll have seen this coming. I don't think many Western governments appear to have seen this coming. I think they'll have to decide, do they want to encourage many of these rebel groups? They'll be talking to the Turkish government, which will have the most intimate understanding on the ground. The Americans will be asking how does this affect their own Kurdish allies, because as Turkish-backed groups advance, the Kurdish groups will also be having to sort of maneuver the situation very delicately. And the Americans will be asking, where does this leave their position? But by and large, I think this is not going to be shaped by what the UK or France or the United States says or does in the next few days. This is going to be shaped principally by dynamics and forces internal to Syria.
And what will Iran think about this?
Oh, well, Iran's going to be very deeply concerned. Iran was also, along with Russia, a major supporter of the Assad regime. Iran was certainly no friend of groups like HTS, who it views as dangerous Sunni Islamist radicals threatening their own position in the region, but also threatening Muslim minorities in Syria. That's the Iranian view. They'll be asking how can they continue to back the Assad regime. But of course, as I said at the beginning, this is occurring in part because Iran's ally Hezbollah and Iran itself, to some degree, have been weakened and distracted by the events of the last 6 months. They've been smashed by the Israelis, to put it very simply. So Iran's not necessarily going to be in a political or military position to extend massive amounts of support to a regime that it once backed to the hilt.
And final, a couple of questions to Shashank. Assad has gone to meet Putin. I mean, Putin's very focused on this Ukraine conflict. How much time and bandwidth will Russia give to what's happening in Syria, given what's happening in Ukraine?
I think they'll be paying very close attention, not least because Assad is in Moscow now, as far as we know, although the Russian government isn't commenting on it publicly. And so they'll be asking, this is a threat to our position. We can't allow this government to fall. That would be a major Western victory. It would weaken our position in the region. It would weaken our reputation with Iran. It would weaken our prestige. I think they'll be very concerned about that. But they'll also have to balance the resources that they're sending to Syria, given how much they need in Ukraine. So Russia will be, I think, really, really closely invested. On top of that, of course, it's worth mentioning Russia also maintains a naval facility in Tartus on the Mediterranean coast, which is very important to the Russian Navy's position in the Med. And I think that from their perspective, they will, let's remember here, they are the ones who came in 10 years ago, a bit more than 10 years ago, I think, in saving the regime, stepping in and effectively bailing it out. So they will not want to see Assad go down.
Gosh, it's so interesting, isn't it? So Russia's going to be potentially fighting on a number of fronts, and all the interconnected geopolitics is fascinating. And final question to you: what do you think this means for ordinary people in Syria?
Well, it means initially more violence, more fighting, more bombing. And whilst there are many, many people in Aleppo who are obviously delighted by the news of the defeat of the regime, a regime that's very widely despised, there's no question of that. I think there will be questions over what will HTS be doing in terms of how it governs the areas that it's conquering. There certainly have been concerns over some of the other areas it's governed and the way it's done so. But I think there'll
And just
also
quickly,
be
jump in, how does it treat women?
well, I mean, it's changed over time, but it's a conservative political Islamist group. So, of course, it's not running these places in a highly liberal fashion. What it has done in recent days is reach out to Christian communities in the area, saying, actually, we're not interested in kind of highly sectarian policies. We're interested in sort of ruling pragmatically. But I think I recently, earlier this morning, read over the State Department's human rights report for Syria for the last 2 years, and they expressed very grave concerns about HTS, and particularly its treatment of political opposition, the way it detains people, the occurrence of torture. So, I don't think HTS is unique in this regard. You could say the same for many rebel or kind of organizations, many warlords inside the country. There's nothing unique about that in that sense. But I think the people will be asking a lot of these questions. And I think finally, they'll be worried about the response from the regime, because as I said, the Russians have begun bombing again for the first time since 2016. The Syrian regime will be conducting strikes. These are not going to be, precise, precision-guided strikes. They're going to be pretty brutal, pretty vicious, and I think the result's going to be a lot of civilian harm in the coming days.